Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the All Words Are Free podcast. So today is the first episode in a little mini series that I'm putting together on different book genres, and I am getting in different people for every episode to talk about the genre and what they love so much about it. So today we're talking about fantasy, which should be a really fun one because it's a kind of lesser known perhaps genre for me. I don't tend to gravitate towards it, but we're going to be talking to Cam, who does gravitate towards it. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Cameron. I've always really liked fantasy. I classify myself as a big reader. I definitely 100% was when I was younger. I would read over 100 books a year, and that was
oh my gosh, that's
crazy. That's all I would do. Yeah, it was like my main thing. I'm slightly less now that I'm working and I'm busy and stuff, but I definitely still love reading, and it's one of my favorite hobbies. And as you said, I definitely gravitate towards fantasy. I'd say sci-fi fantasy is pretty much the only stuff I read, really. Not necessarily the kind of classic fantasy. I really this might be strange considering we're here to talk about fantasy, but I haven't really read any of the main classic fantasy books. Yeah. But the newer fantasy stuff I'm a big fan of.
Nice, very cool. But I guess a slight side note before I get onto the fantasy stuff is you are big on the book scene, right?
Well, I was, yeah. I posted a lot on TikTok specifically. For a good couple of years, I would post almost every day, talking about books. And after I went to uni doing my undergrad in Oxford, I would post a lot about that as well. Not so much anymore. I haven't posted anything since last October. Yeah, I want to say it's been a while, over a year since I stopped posting. But and I kind of stepped away from even going on TikTok at all. So I haven't really been engaging with books stuff in the media at all really recently, which is a shame because I think it is a great space. And I have a lot of respect for the people who do it, and I think it has the potential to create really amazing communities of people who just love reading, and I think that can be a really wholesome thing, and it's one of those hobbies that in the general population is kind of looked down on a little bit.
Yeah, it is.
A lot of people, if you say oh yes, I'm a big reader, they're immediately oh nerd. Yeah. Are you you actually have fun doing that? That's wild. But so I think a community of readers is always one that's going to have that kind of shared experience of being a bit looked down upon, not to a huge extent, but enough that it kind of is a nice way to bond people together. It also can be a bit there is often a lot of turmoil within bookish communities based on there's always some drama, always and it's always the same things over and over again. There's no way you could possibly read that much in a year or whatever. There's the same conversation
I'm sure you've seen
again.
it all.
Yeah. There's a lot of it, but I think at its core, if you can kind of look past that and create the community that you want to be a part of, it can be a really nice place. But it can be a lot of work to make it into a nice place.
I was going to say, because it's quite, you see these videos and it's there's so much work's gone behind that, and how long it takes just to put together a 30-second video.
Crazy. And the thing about TikTok specifically is that it's so at its core an algorithm, and it pushes what the algorithm wants. So you can put hours into a 30-second video, and it's you talking and really going in depth into a plot of a book and really dissecting why you liked it, and you're really proud of it, and you've spent hours doing the captioning and making sure that you're holding the book up at the right time and all these things. But someone who's just kind of, and I would do this as well, I would film myself reading and put that on, and that was so easy. It took 2 seconds, and that would get so many more views than anything I put work into, and that can be really disheartening, especially if you are someone who is big on wanting views and wanting to have engagement, and that's a fair thing to want. If you're putting work into it, you want it to be appreciated.
100%. I mean, that's what I'm doing right now.
Completely. And I think lots of people will say, oh, don't worry about the views, like just do it because you love it. And it is good advice, but it's really hard to follow.
It is.
Because yeah, when you're working on something and putting so much effort into it, it's such a shame when people aren't appreciating it and you want it to be engaged with. That's why you're making it, is to have people respond to it and open up these conversations on these things. So it is hard advice, but I think it is good advice if you are making something primarily because you love it and secondarily because you want it to be engaged with. That's what's going to keep you going for longer, I think. And that's why I did it for so long, is because I did really enjoy making the videos. It can be very good fun, and it's nice to have a place to talk about it, because I do still really like talking about books. Like every time I get an opportunity to, I will sit someone down who does not care and explain to them the plot of my book that I'm currently reading.
No, honestly, I'm completely of the same kind of thoughts. But no, it is one of those things. It is that you want to do it for the love of it, but there is that little thing of like, well, I want people to appreciate it and see it as well, because I mean, like, I'm writing essays and doing these for people to listen or read them, right? So it's a balancing act, I guess, in a way. But
no, absolutely.
It's hard, but good advice. But anyway, onto the topic at hand. So you said about like classic fantasy and stuff, which is like Lord of the Rings.
Haven't read it.
No, because that for me is like, I guess I'm kind of the other way around, in that Lord of the Rings is one of the only like fantasy things that I've read, and I love it, and I also love the films. So I think maybe like seeing the film kind of biased me towards liking the books in a way. So I saw the films first.
I mean, I think there's so much to take from Lord of the Rings, because it is such a classic fantasy, and so many of its tropes have like come into modern fantasy, and modern fantasy is so shaped by those like first couple of big fantasy series. I think it is really important, but I still haven't read it, and I keep saying that I need to, because I think it is really valuable to kind of read those and learn from them, and be able to look at what you're reading now kind of with the lens that it's been shaped by that. And I think it kind of puts a spin on what you'll be reading now. And I do know, like, I have an understanding of what the Lord of the Rings is. Do you know what I mean?
The lore,
I understand that. I can't believe I've never read it. It's just there's always something to read. There's always something to read.
No, 100%.
And you can never get to everything.
My list is like, it's crazy. You have this like to read list, which is like absolutely massive, and then you finish a book and you're like, I have nothing to read. And it's like, no. I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like, Do you think there's anything in particular that's kind of stopped you from going for it, or just other things come along?
I think, I mean, I'm really big on making sure that what I'm reading is diverse, and that I'm like looking at different perspectives on the world. And I think fantasy is a really good way to talk about the real world in a kind of strange way. It's a good way of like twisting what we have, putting it into this fantasy world, and being able to explore different possibilities of what our world could look like if a certain thing was changed. And then it's just, I think it's a really interesting way to look at the struggles that people here face and these things. And I think diversity is really important in that way, to be able to look at that also from different perspectives. And I just can never find myself quite to be interested enough in what like a cishet white man thinks. I always will gravitate towards like queer stories or POC stories or disabled stories or whatever it might be, just to kind of open my eyes a bit more, because I think fantasy is such a good way of doing that. It's such a good way of thinking about what could be or what might be, or
it's very kind of allegorical.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, sometimes the real world is a really hard place, and it's really hard to confront what's happening, and it's really difficult to have to sit down and watch real people really struggle and learn directly from there. And it's really important to do that. I think that's it's so vital for us to be able to learn from the real world and look at the real world and grapple with that. But it can be really difficult. And I think fantasy is a great way to learn and to understand real people's experience, because it's real people are writing the books and they're putting their experiences into it. It's a great way to learn from real people, but be able to look at it in a slightly different way. and still learn and still experience, and really, because people empathize with characters so much, especially if you're reading from the perspective of someone, you have to empathize with them to kind of enjoy the book, I think.
Yes.
Of course there are like dislikable main characters, and that can be great fun. That can be really fun, don't get me wrong, but if you're empathizing with the character and what they're going through, that's a really good way to look at other people's struggles, and look at things from a different point of view. And I think that should be done alongside learning from the real world, definitely. I think this is not to say that, forget what's happening in the real world, let's only look at fantasy.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to do side by side. And from an author's perspective, if you're going through something awful, that can be really hard to write about from this is what I went through, this is like a bibliography of mine. Biography. Yeah. That's a really difficult thing to write about. But being able to kind of put a character like you in a fantasy world and talk about your struggles from that perspective can be a lot easier to do, and also to think about in a slightly different way and all of these things. So for me, fantasy is just, it's a lot. Fantasy is a lot of things.
Yeah.
It can be really great for escapism, and which is the opposite of that, pretty much. Like being able to go into a completely different world and forget about this real world problems. But it's also a really good way to think about the real world in a slightly different way and think about what might have been. And for me, that's really important. That's what I like in my fantasy, is thinking about all of these different things. And whilst older fantasy has shaped everything that fantasy is now, and that's really important, it's also not a great way for me to do that, I think. Yeah. Like, if what I'm looking for in fantasy is a way to look at the current real world through a different lens, looking at what was written a while ago, is not going to help me with that. Hopefully that made sense. That was a long-winded way of saying that.
Completely makes sense. I mean, 100%, because I think that also, if you're reading stuff that's current and then you go back, it's kind of like the current stuff has been built off what was written ages ago and is developed along with the times, per se, right? And I think, it's so wonderful that in literature in general, but I think, like you say, with fantasy in particular, it's got that escapism element, but it's also such a diverse genre in the way that you can explore personal stories or world issues or anything like that. I mean, honestly, as you're describing it, I'm like, maybe I should get more into it. Maybe I should read some more.
There are some really great ones that grapple with some really interesting and hard to grapple with stuff, and it does it in a really interesting way. I think.
Recommendations?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the ones that the first one that comes to mind for me is the Unbroken by C.L. Clarke, which I don't actually think I gave 5 stars, but it's the first one that comes to mind as one that it's about colonialism, and it's someone the main character has been. I read this a while ago, so you're testing my memory of the books I'm reading. It's someone who had been taken as a child from a colonized country, and taken to the colonizer country and raised as a soldier, and she's coming back years later to the country that's been colonized as an enforcer of the colonial system, and she's grappling with my roots are here and the people who look like me are here, and I was born here and I technically am a person of this country, but I've been raised to think this way. My job is thinking this other way. And she's kind of grappling with that. It's a really interesting look on colonialization, but it's set in a complete fantasy world, so there's magic and all of these things. But it's a really interesting way of looking at it, and really a really hard situation to grapple with, this kind of a torn person. But that's something that happens a lot in real life as well, is having these kind of two sides of yourself that you're grappling with.
Yes, precisely.
And in lots of different ways. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting book. And there's so many like that. There's so much fantasy that's similar to that. And I think it's, really cool. It's a really cool genre.
No, that's really interesting, I mean, I guess that kind of nature versus nurture question, maybe. But I think that for me, in concept, a lot of it's so so interesting, and I think that if it was a book club or whatever, I think it'd be a really, really great conversation starter and ways to kind of start these conversations in a very approachable way.
Yes,
and I think Yeah, no, I think it's wonderful. I guess I always, and this is like completely awful, and people can, I mean, you can shout at me, but I always associated fantasy with kind of YA or like, do you know what I mean? I feel like it's looked down upon in a way, and I think I've not, well, I'm confronting my biases now perhaps, but I'd never looked at it as something for me because it didn't, because it felt like maybe kind of the magic and all that jazz, it was very kind of Harry Potter kind of, like YA kind of associated, but I think that, I mean, as you talk about it, it's obviously very adult, very current kind of themes.
I mean, there are a lot of great YA fantasies out there, and ones that are very enjoyable to read, and also some can grapple with these. One good one that is I think is classified as YA is Legendborn. Great story, really, really cool. It's talks about so many different things. It's a black main character going into this school where it's a very largely white school, and it's very elitist, and there's this group of people who are descendants of the Knights of the Round Table, and she comes into this situation, and every other person, I think maybe bar one, is like white, and they really look down on her, and like her ancestors were slaves, and she's kind of dealing with that and learning about that herself, but also kind of trying to fit in this community, and it's so interesting, and it talks about so many different things, and it's YA. And it's written in, I'd say it's like a bit of an older YA. I wouldn't recommend it for very young teenagers, but it is still classed as YA. It's on the YA section at bookshops, and it's just great. So there are a lot of great YA like fantasies out there that can also grapple with these, but a lot of fantasy is adult, and I mostly read adult fantasy now, and there are some, like Legendborn, I would say is a good kind of way to step into that if you've only been, there are some good ones that are kind of in the middle, and a lot of great fantasy is YA, but there is a lot of YA fantasy, and I think that's kind of, when people are learning about the different genres, normally they're a bit younger and they're looking at it through a YA lens. The only real books that they would ever read are YA, so they're kind of judging on what they like based on what is young adult literature. But I think there is lots of difference in fantasy between YA and adult. I think there's a very like stark line, which I think is probably there for, I mean, I'm not well versed in other genres, so I wouldn't really know, but I'm assuming it's that is a clear difference between YA and adult in other genres, but I don't know whether it would be as clear based on what I've read from fantasy as it is in fantasy. I think they can be really different types of books. And part of that is because fantasy is such a wide genre, especially if you take into account like sci-fi and stuff as well. It's so huge, and there are so many different things in it. But that is definitely, for me at least, a very clear difference between YA and adult. And that can make it quite intimidating to switch from YA to adult. I remember I took quite a while to stop reading YA and start reading adult because I was very intimidated by it because it is so different. And adult fantasy as well can be really intimidating just because of the size of them. Some of them are
so thick. I pick it up and I'm like,
my wrist is going to break. They're huge, and the series can be so long. That's another thing with fantasy, that often long series. Which other books are normally like at max a trilogy, but fantasy can be like the Robin Hood books, which I haven't read, but I know I haven't read them because there's like a million of them. You can't fit them on one bookshelf. There's genuinely, I don't know off the top of my head, but over 20, I think, Robin Hood books, and they're all like hundreds of pages.
That would take my entire lifetime.
But they're apparently very good. Apparently I should read them, which I should. But so I get it. Basically, fantasy books can be really intimidating. But I picked up The Power of the Orange Tree. I don't know if you've seen that. That's the big one.
Yeah, the big one.
By Samantha Shannon. And I was thinking, I'm never going to get through this. Like I was putting it off for ages. It was sitting on my shelf for a couple of years before I read it. And I was like, it's going to drag so much. How am I going to get through this? It was so good. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. And I wish I'd read it sooner. And then I read its sequel, and that was also really good. And I think it's a shame that it puts people off. And it puts everyone off. Like, even people who read fantasy like me, it puts me off, and I think that's another reason why people don't consider adult fantasy so much, just because they can be, it's quite an intimidating space to walk into. And also, if you don't know a lot about fantasy, sometimes it can be it's hard to get used to reading about world building, for example, and hard to get used to reading about a magic system, and there's a lot to learn with that. Like, you need to learn about like political systems and like how the specifics of magic, and normally in an adult fantasy they try and make it a bit more scientific as well, so they'll try and introduce like sciencey terms into their magic system and stuff, which is really cool.
I can vibe with that.
Really cool. Hard to figure out if you don't get it. You need, and as well as me, and normally there's huge cast of characters as well, so you need to meet everyone, learn about their relationships to each other. I understand it, definitely. It can be really intimidating. It's you need to be focused, and like other genres where you can kind of read it and just not think too much and just have a good time, and you're like meeting a couple of characters and it's set in this world, and it might be in a city that you've been to, and there are characters that are experiencing something really similar to you, like a romance. It's like, oh, I've been in love like that once before. I've been there, I've done that. With fantasy, it's like, oh yes, this person's riding a dragon. I can't relate to that. I don't know what that's like. And you have to figure out how to conceptualize those experiences. But it's so much fun once you do. And I really like learning. I love learning new things. And I think fantasy, which is a really good way to do that, is to like learn new things, because it introduces a whole new world to you. It's not necessarily learning something that's going to super help you in your life.
It might do.
It might do. And like before, if it's grappling about the real world issues, that's really helpful. But you know, I don't necessarily need to know like 50 species of dragon in my day-to-day life. But it's fun. And if you have fun doing that, fantasy is a great way to learn more things, which again is not something that people really consider. Like, as you were saying, fantasy is often seen as something that's a bit frivolous and fun, and and I think that's why people don't kind of consider YA and adult fantasy to be even the same genre, because YA fantasy is seen as this like fun, silly little magic thing, and adult fantasy is this, oh my god, I need to learn like 50 different names of people that all sound like, that all are written like someone just threw some letters on the page and scrambled them around. How am I going to do that? They feel very different. But
I love those little like, you know, they do the character like the trees and like the little maps. I love that, because I'm like, you know, they mention a place, I'm like, where is that? But no, that sounds that's really cool. I think, and like with the YA stuff, it's kind of the transitional stuff that you were talking about, like it potentially could be like and probably is like a really nice way to kind of talk to younger people about world issues as well, and kind of educate them in a way that's much more approachable than like you say, like the news or whatever. Because I do mean, this is me going off on a slightly different thing, but I do think that children aren't included enough in like these conversations when they completely have the capacity to. It's just, you know, people kind of don't expect them to in a way, and like you said, I think like that transitional like YA or whatever in the messages, it's kind of allowing them to enter the conversation. I agree. Children have a lot more capacity than people think they do, and I think there's this general sense that we want to shield children from hard things, precisely, and not like don't let them know about that. They don't need to be thinking about that yet. That's too hard for them to grapple with, when they can grapple with it. And children have such a capacity for empathy, I think, that adults don't really give them credit for, and I probably
think
more than adults.
And being able to read about something from someone else's perspective is a great way to kind of immediately induce empathy in people. You like I was saying, you need to be able to empathize with a main character to kind of understand what you're reading about. Almost you want to be able to understand why they're doing what they're doing. I hate books when I can't understand why the main character's making the decisions that they do. They can disagree with me, but if I understand why they're disagreeing with me, that's still good. So being able to understand what someone else is thinking and why they're doing what they're doing, and really see the world, even if it's a different world, from someone else's shoes, is a great way to learn empathy, I think. But children are so can be part of the conversation and should be, because it's going to be their world. Like,
precisely.
They're going to be the ones who are inheriting it, so I don't know why they're not considered as much. And yeah, fantasy is a really good way to kind of eat people onto it. Because I think a lot of people read books and they're like, oh, this war in this book is so awful and terrible. I'm so glad nothing like that happens in real life. And you have to be like, well, that's based on this thing that's happening right now. Yeah. And they're like, oh. And I've seen so many people kind of come to that realization that what they were reading about and so horrified by is something that's really happening. Yeah. And the rush of empathy that they feel is like so important. And yeah, I think it's a really good way to think about things.
Yeah. There are so many more correlations between kind of, you know, fantasy to fiction to anything and the real world. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you know, authors get inspiration from their daily lives and from what they see around them, and so, you know, it's gonna impact what gets down on the page. Mm-hmm. So, if you were on a desert island,
yes,
and you could only have 3 books, okay, what would they be?
The first one would be The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is my favourite book of all time. Oh. Which is so good. And I've been meaning... I read it years ago for the first time and I haven't reread it since then. I've been meaning to, because it's one of those books where once you've read it once, you understand so much more, and you reread it with a completely different gaze. Like, you completely... It would reshape your whole understanding of the book. So I've been meaning to reread it, but I can't bring myself to, because it was so good the first time. I don't want to taint it for myself. I think it's such a cool book. I really, really like it. My second one would be, I think, If This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is a sci-fi. It's really short, it's a novella, so it's probably a bad choice because it wouldn't take me very long to read. But I've read that one. I have reread loads of times. I think it's so good. It's another one that you get something new from every time you read it. It's so interesting. It's very hard to explain. It's really, really cool. Yeah, I think it's one. This Is How You Lose Time War is one of those books that you need to read without understanding anything that's happening. Be completely confused your first read through. Spend 200 pages being like, what is happening? What is this? What is going on? What is this? And then immediately start it from the beginning and understand a little bit more the next time. You're like, okay, I'm seeing what's happening here, and then reread it again, and then understand a bit more. Nice. And it's short enough that you can do that, which is fun. It's really cool. I have made a video on TikTok a couple of years ago that I tried to give like an actual description of what happened in the book, because a lot of people read it once and like, I didn't understand that, must be a bad book, and that that annoys me so much. I'm like, no, it's so good. So I made a video like explaining like the plot line as clearly as I could, which was kind of difficult, but and so many people in the comments said, oh, that's what happened. That makes sense. I understand. Like, that's what's happening. It's one of those books where you really can't tell whether something is a metaphor or not, which I think is really cool.
That's really interesting.
Really cool. And often it's not a metaphor, but it reads like a metaphor. So you're thinking that all this written by 2 people. I think. Oh, I don't want to get it wrong. I think they might be husband and wife, but I'm not entirely sure. So don't quote me on that. They write in a way that really sounds like metaphor, but that's not. It's really cool. That is really cool book.
But yeah, I mean, you persevered for everyone then. If you've read it multiple times and then like telling everyone what it is, and now they can appreciate it. That sounds it's such really interesting
book. And my third one.
Number 3.
I'm thinking maybe Babel, R.F. Kuang.
Oh yeah.
Which is good because it's big, so it will take a while to read, which is good for a desert island if you can only have 3. And I think it's a really interesting book. It's not fun to read, that's for sure. It will not, but I think it's important to read, and I think it contains a lot in it. I don't know if you've read it or.
I haven't, but I want to. Yeah. Because I read Yellowface.
Oh, yeah.
Which is like so apparently very different.
Very different, yeah.
Which is like really interesting from the same author.
Yeah. R.F. Kuang is, I think she's really cool. I went to a talk by her a couple of years ago, and I was flabbergasted. I have a lot of respect for her. I think she's a really cool person. She writes very interestingly about very hard things, and I think she does it in a very nuanced way. I think it's interesting because I don't know if I actually sat down with the points that she was making and properly analysed them, that I agree with every single one of them, but I think they're all really valuable points to consider. I think she's a very cool person. And I like that in an author. I like when I can kind of see their viewpoint quite clearly, and I have a lot of respect for authors who make very clear points. And R.F. Kuang, actually, I think in kind of the Poppy was her first trilogy that she's written, which is also like heavy. It's a heavy trilogy, very good though. And Babel is also really heavy. There's not that much. Like she says her point quite plainly. It's like quite obvious to know what she's thinking and what she's trying to say. And I think a lot of people criticize those books for that and say, oh, it should be more nuanced. Like she should let the reader think about it themselves. Sure, okay. But I don't know. I think
I want to be told.
I'm not even necessarily. Yeah. I do enjoy having to like puzzle things out for myself as a reader. But I think there's the things that she's saying. Colonialism is bad, for example. Sure. Yeah. Can just be said and stated. Like we shouldn't have to try and come to that conclusion as a reader. That should be a foregone conclusion. Mm-hmm. And she says that and then talks about it from a character's perspective or through these different lenses. And I think, I don't know, I don't think there's anything bad about that. And a lot of people seem to. I think she's quite divisive. A lot of the early readers of Babel are a big fan because they like got an early copy, for example, because they really love the Poppy War, and they tend to like Babel as well. I love Babel. I think it's really like heavy, good, like solid book. I really like it. But then a lot of the people who saw those glowing reviews then read it got very popular, lots of people were reading it, and a lot of the people who read it kind of later down the line didn't like it as much, partially because they had these glowing reviews and had very high expectations.
Well, that is another thing,
which is another thing about kind of bookish communities. It's very easy to get very high expectations of books from them, which can frequently be a bit, and then you find them disappointing, and then
shade.
But yeah, a lot of the people who kind of read it secondarily didn't like it as much, which I think is a shame. But and that's another thing about bookish communities, is that the books get so talked about everywhere and everyone kind of knows the name, and it's like, oh, this book is really popular, I should read it, even if it doesn't sound like something they'd like. And I think there's a lot of it's important to know what books you like and what you like in a book, and pick the books that you know that you'll like. There's no point to me in seeing something that you know you're not going to like in a book and reading it anyway, and then going on about how bad it is.
Yeah, because you're almost searching to hate something.
Yeah, and I think, don't get me wrong, sometimes it's fun to read something that is really rubbish, and that can be enjoyable in a different kind of way. But I think criticising a book for containing something that is subjectively bad isn't necessarily helpful, especially when it's I've seen a lot of people who, for example, if they see a really popular fantasy book, they've never read fantasy before, they don't like magic, they want to read something quite simple and set in like the city that they live in and know really well, and with all of the experiences that they've experienced, but they see a popular fantasy book and they think, oh, I'll read that anyway, and then they're like, oh, it had so much magic in it. I really didn't like it. It had so much magic in it. I really would recommend it. It was so fantastical and just so unrealistic. I didn't like it.
That's
what did you expect?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Like, fine, it's fair for people not to like that, but don't go and complain about it and make other people not want to pick it up just because it's got these things that you don't like. And I think Babel is a good example of that, because it is something that is quite specific to people. And I do think there are definitely lots of people who wouldn't like it, even though it does have very important things to say. And I think it is an important book to read because it's got a lot of important messaging in it. And I think R.F. Kuang has quite a valuable perspective on things like academia and like colonialism and these like prejudices within academia and equality within academia and all these sorts of things. She has valuable perspectives on it. So I think it's an important book to read, but I definitely don't think everyone's going to like it. It's got quite a unique writing style that was really my thing, but I don't think will be a lot of other people's things. And a lot of people have read it and not really liked it. But anyway, Desert Island.
Fancy the Desert Island.
It would. I think it would be on my list. I think that would be my third one. I'm trying to think if there's something key that I've missed. Oh, I also do really like Howl's Moving Castle, and I've read that one over and over again, which is middle grade, but contains lots of joy. I think if I wanted to if I was on a scary desert island, or one that the one that I didn't like and it was awful, and if I was relaxed on the beach, I wouldn't mind bringing quite a heavy book. But if I needed distracting from how awful the island was, yeah, then I'd bring Howl's, because it's I think the book that brings me the most joy every time I reread it. It's just very sweet. Yes, it's a happy little book. Yeah,
no, that's really lovely. Yeah, because I don't know, I think sometimes people can go into reading wanting a message or something heavy and whatever, and I think that these kind of very joyous books aren't really, I don't know, maybe praised as much or seen as valuable, because they're not necessarily teaching, and they may be teaching you something, but they're not necessarily got a heavy purpose or whatever. It's just we're just doing this for the joy of it. And I think, going back to the point we said earlier about reading being seen as this kind of looked down upon thing or hobby, it's that it's nice to just be able to sit and read and enjoy something and not have to see it as some sort of productive endeavour. And reading is an essential way to gain knowledge, understand the world, etc. And I think it is looked down upon in kind of comparison to doing work or anything like that. It's not seen, like I say, as a kind of productive thing, which is sad. And it shaded my kind of relationship with reading in that I kind of didn't spend time reading what I a fiction or whatever, and I focused more time on work or studying or whatever, and then you fall out of reading books. Since coming to uni, it's during term time it was my books I rarely read one, and then you go home and read a lot more, and you're oh, I remember loving this is great. And I think as a writer myself as well, I think you forget the value of consuming literature and how that influences you and makes you excited about writing. You don't have to be sitting writing all the time and not kind of just sitting kind of passively taking something, or not necessarily passively, but just taking something in. It's it's a very valuable thing. And so it's just nice to talk to people who also value it. But slightly non-book wise, I wanted to do this with everyone because I thought it'd be fun. What's your favourite non-book thing to do in your spare time?
Well, it changes quite a lot. I'm definitely someone who gets really focused on a hobby, and that's all I want to do all the time and never do anything else. Right now, it's something that I'm trying not to be embarrassed about. I think it's okay. Wait, let me phrase it.
Reverse.
So I'm very much into right now playing The Sims 4.
Oh, cool.
Which I think is something that I don't know why I've got this thing to be embarrassed about it. I don't know what it is about. I don't know whether it's because it is a video game, but it's not a video game. Do you know what I mean? It's this little thing that is just a bit silly and not that, but I think it's really fun, and I'm having a good time doing it. I dressed it was Winterfest in my Sims game yesterday, and I dressed all of my Sims in Christmas themed outfits. It was really good fun.
I actually love that.
Yeah, it's a fun little game. I'm having a good time doing it, and I go in and out of being obsessed with The Sims every so often, and I'm definitely in a era of just wanting to play it all the time. And another thing that I would say is my permanent favorite thing is I always like doing is Dungeons and Dragons, which is another
Yes,
very fantasy themed
nice,
thing, but
nice.
not both thing. I'm actually have a session later today, so which will hopefully be good.
Yeah.
I'm excited about that one. Yeah, but that's fun, and it is, for me, it kind of is related to reading because it's related to fantasy, which is kind of inextricable from reading to me because I only really read fantasy. But it's also about world building and creating characters and
I love that.
a story. It's fundamentally Dungeons and Dragons is just cooperatively telling a story. So it's just basically a way of reading and writing and doing it with your friends. So I think it's great. I have a very good time doing that. And I think if you like fantasy, kind of bringing it back, if you like fantasy, I think Dungeons and Dragons is a really good way to get yourself more involved in the stories that you're consuming, because it's so fun being able to like be a character in what you're doing. And kind of getting to shape that, and it's a slightly different way of consuming a story in a more active way, which doesn't always have to play. Sometimes it is just fun to kind of sit and read something and understand it and not be a part of it, because sometimes that's what's needed, but sometimes it's fun to be a part of it and shape it in your own way, and to do that with friends is also fun. It's a good time. And this was being like a dungeon master, creating the story and all of these things is so much fun, and it's very much helped by reading fantasy. I think it can shape the worlds you create and the plot lines you kind of throw your players in and all of these things. So it's a fun game. And I also like it for the ways that you have a structure, and there are things like books and books of rules, and you can follow them if you like, but it's also your game and you're playing it how you want to, and the only people who are going to know if you break the rules are your players, who you're probably like breaking the rules to kind of suit them, for them to have more fun. So like, who cares? And you can take on the rules if you need the structure of them. You can also discard them whenever you like. But it makes for a better game. Do whatever, and I think that's fun. I like that. I've had to kind of understand that. I'm quite a rule-orientated person, and I think the moment in D&D where I realised the rules are just there for you to have more fun, and you can throw them away if that's more fun, that was when I properly started liking DMing D&D. Those are my things right now.
No, that's really fun. That's really cool. No, I know a lot of people who like play D&D, and it's like, it does sound so fun because it's like you get to you become that character, and then everyone is like playing their characters, and so that really kind of immerses you in the world in a way, which again is like that wonderful thing about fantasy and the escapism side of it, I suppose, as well. But it's really cool, really fun. Final little thing. So I also wanted to do a little kind of like book swap vibe, and I haven't actually got a book with me.
Yes.
But the book swap kind of idea was that you recommend something to me, and I recommend something to you.
Yes.
And I've already got several recommendations from you. However, like, single book that would, me as a kind of fantasy slight outsider at the moment, what would you recommend to me to bring me into the fold?
That's a really good question.
You get me hooked on the series.
To be fair, I think a lot of the ones that I've mentioned are ones that are probably for people who've read a lot of fantasy. Like, this is how you lose the time war, I would not recommend to someone who hasn't read a lot of fantasy. Same with the fifth season. It's one that's like kind of complex and mind-bending almost. That's a really good question. I'm trying to think what I've been...
So I had time to prepare.
You put me on the spot. I don't know. I do think Legendborn is a good one, because again, it's like a bridging YA adult one, and I think ones in that like space are good, but it is quite heavy. I'm
like writing these down.
I'm trying to visualize my shelves.
Yeah.
As we speak.
I can imagine that you'd have a really impressive bookshelf. I think it would look gorgeous.
At my like childhood home, my bookshelf kind of spans all of the walls around my bed.
Oh my gosh, that's so
huge.
cool.
Yeah, and then I've got another one for the books I haven't read yet. Really big. My books in my current house is still quite big because I've bought a lot since I've lived there, but slightly less impressive.
That's really cool.
Oh, this is hard. I might have to consult my story graph.
That's okay. I love Storygraph.
Oh, it's my
It's so
favourite
good.
app.
I find it really funny when you like, you plug in a load of books that you've read. I spent one evening literally just plugging in a load of books when I first downloaded it, and seeing the genres, and my top 3 were like reflective, emotional, and dark. I was like, yeah, that's about right.
That feels right. Oh, I've got one. This is a book called Light from Uncommon Stars. It's by Rika Aoki. It's set in this world, so it's like an urban fantasy. It's wacky. It's not very, like, the writing isn't very complex. It's quite easy to follow writing style. It's like an adult book, written like for adults, but the writing style is quite easy to follow. It's about a transgender violinist who runs away and is kind of taken in by a violin trainer who's actually made a deal with the devil to sell the souls of 7 violinists. Ooh. And this is her final one. And it's kind of them. There's also some plotline about, I read this a while ago again. There's also some plotline about an alien coming down and taking a donut shop and running a donut shop and trying to turn it into a spacecraft. There's some moments of it like that are quite light and quite funny. There are some moments of it that are really dark, and it's a good one. I think it's a really interesting portrayal of the trans experience, and a good way to kind of grapple with how hard that can be. And the main character like really struggles like a lot of the time and has had a very dark life that a lot of people do have. But it's good. It's also uplifting in a way. Like the relationships between people are strong and they like build up over the course of the book. And it is like fantasy in that it's like there's like deals with the devil being made and there's aliens and all of these things. But it's also very real. And I think it's probably a good one to start with, I'd say. And it's also good book.
That sounds really interesting. It sounds really cool. I love the whole like 7 violinist thing. That sounds really cool. No, I've written those down. I'm gonna get like such a little list together at the end of this series. It's gonna be great. I'm gonna like go in Waterstones and just buy. Well, I guess that's like product placement, whatever. But go in Waterstones and like buy a load of these books. That'd be really fun. But yeah, I guess so. Because fantasy and sci-fi kind of link in a lot of ways, but like are also quite, I mean, I don't know what you think about that, like they're quite similar in a lot of ways, and I think that sci-fi particularly is the genre that I'm like, it feels odd to read, but to kind of test myself out, I listened to this podcast episode where they were talking about Octavia Butler. Yes. And you may have already read this then. And they were talking about like different novels and stuff. And they said that a really good one to start with was Kindred.
I've been meaning to read Kindred for such a long time. I've heard such good things about it, but I have not read it.
That is my recommendation. It is honestly absolutely wonderful.
Okay, this is my sign then.
It's just so kind of layered, and it's like not that long, so it's very digestible, but it's so layered and so interesting and says so much about the topics that it discusses, and it's just how like character comparisons and like how when one is placed in a particular time, how that kind of shapes them as a person. It's just really, really cool, which kind of links back to the when you talked about earlier where she was like raised as a soldier and then goes into, but yeah, it is truly, truly wonderful.
Okay, that's my sign then.
Yeah, I'd be interested in reading more Octavia Butler where they're kind of, I'd say that's the least kind of sci-fi one, quote unquote. So yeah, it kind of inducted me into the world slightly, and it was quite a fun one. But yes, I have many more inductions now to delve into. But yeah, is there anything else you wanted to say before we sign off? I don't know why I'm doing like sign language right now, but yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think fantasy is so
cool and so good, and I think people who haven't should definitely give it a chance. It's I think a lot of the things that people don't like about fantasy are not things that are about fantasy. I think they're things about some books that they've read that happen to be fantasy.
Right.
I think I think you can get so much out of fantasy, especially because there's like low fantasy, which is set in our world with some fantastical elements. Or there's all of these different things. It's such a huge genre, and I think what you're looking for, you almost certainly can find in a fantasy book somewhere. You just have to look for it.
That's amazing. Well, yeah, thank you so much. That was great. I had a really nice chat. But yeah, so thank you, everyone, all the many people. Thank you so much for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Take care, and let's keep talking.